children lost, ensnared by a witch's binding spell. Jessiie, the awakened soul, yearns to escape and find a new home. Dare you join her and explore more?
Okay, so let's get right into today's video talking about the giggling granny. This was an infamous, creepy killer from the early 1900s, and her name was Nanny Doss. So let's talk a little bit about her childhood first. Nanny Doss was born in 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, and she was one of 5 children. And she had a very difficult childhood because she was in a very violent home. Her father was very abusive, he had a bad temper, and she barely ever laughed because she was in such a volatile environment. And at the age of 9, Nanny suffered a traumatic head injury when she hit her head against a metal seat during a train ride. And it's believed that this head injury dramatically changed her personality. After it happened, she began to have chronic headaches, blackouts, and she just did not seem to be the same person that she was before. And that happens with a lot of people with really bad traumatic head injuries. It can just shift your personality right away. As Nanny grew older, she began to read romantic magazines, particularly the Lonely Hearts column. And this really influenced her love life to the point where she got married at only 16 years old. And by the way, Lonely Hearts columns were basically advertisements in the newspaper for people who were single and looking to date or looking to marry. It was basically like 1800s Tinder. So let's move on to the 5 husbands that Nanny Doss had. So like I said, at the age of 16, Nanny Doss had her first husband, and his name was Charlie Braggs. She met him at a local textile factory where they had been co-workers, and after knowing each other for only 4 months, they decided to get married. Now, they had a total of 4 kids together, but ended up getting divorced in 1928. Shortly after, 2 of their children mysteriously died from what was thought to be food poisoning. So Charlie left her and never returned to her. And he actually believed that she poisoned her 2 children. So he ended up leaving with their remaining 2 children because he was terrified that she would do something to them as well. And thank goodness he left, because he would be the only husband she had that wouldn't die by her hand. The next 4 husbands she would marry were in for very bad luck. After the first marriage ended, Nanny wasted no time searching for the next husband. His name was Frank Harrelson, and they met through the Lonely Hearts column in the newspaper. And they stayed together for 16 years until he died under very mysterious circumstances. Then she found her next husband, whose name was Arlie Lanning, and he also soon after died mysteriously. And still after his death, no one was suspecting her. They just thought she was this grieving widow who had super bad luck throughout her life. They thought she was innocent. Then she found her 4th husband, who was Richard Morton, and she met him after she joined this singles club, which was called the Diamond Circle Club. And as you can imagine, yes, he too shortly after died mysteriously. Now, after her 5th husband met the same fate, doctors finally began to become very suspicious of her. So they decided to conduct an autopsy on the very last of her husbands who died, and the autopsy revealed that he had been poisoned. They found this massive dose of poison in his system. They even said that he had enough poison in his remains to kill 20 men, which is insane. So immediately after they made this shocking revelation, they called the police. The police arrested Nanny Doss. She was charged for murder, and she eventually eventually pled guilty. She admitted to killing all of her husbands, except for the first one because he got away. Now, the creepiest part about this whole thing, and one of the main reasons why this case is so famous, was because she giggled every time she talked about how she poisoned her husbands. It was just so unusual. She was interviewed and she would just speak with this huge smile plastered on her face, and she recounted each story like it was a fond memory. It looked like she was pleased that she had committed these crimes. They would ask her how she did it, what poison she used, and she would literally be sitting there giggling, like laughing so hard at what she did, and it was really creeping out the police, the doctors, the interviewers. She explained how she fed her husband sweet potato pies that were laced with arsenic. And because she had such a gleeful attitude while she talked about this, she was named a bunch of different things. The main one was the Giggling Granny, but people also called her the Jolly Black Widow, Lady Bluebeard, the Lonely Hearts Killer, and the Self-Made Widow. And not only did she confess to doing these horrible things to her husbands, but she also confessed to killing 12 people, and they were all in her family. Among these 12 victims were her mother, her sister, her mother-in-law, 2 of her own children, a grandson, and a granddaughter. I mean, she was absolutely horrific. She said she used both rat poison and arsenic to take their lives. And in 1955, Nanny was sentenced to life imprisonment after she was declared insane. And she just kept blaming all of her actions on that head injury that she had as a child, which I'm sure impacted slightly the way that she was just not stable, but you can't blame everything on that. I mean, people have head injuries all the time and they don't go just like offing people. People also said that Nanny's life as a hopeless romantic also pushed her to change husbands on a regular basis. She just longed for certain romantic qualities in her partners, and when she wasn't getting that, she was just quickly moving on to the next person. And normal people would just divorce and move on, but no, she wanted to just end it very quickly. So yeah, this whole case just really creeps me out. And if you guys are really interested in this type of thing and you want me to cover more crimes from the 1800s, early 1900s, give this video a thumbs up and let me know. Maybe comment down below which one you want me to cover. Alright, so let's talk about the unsolved mystery of the Phantom Barber of 1942. So we're first going to talk about this person's victims. Throughout 1942, residents of Pascagoula, Mississippi were terrorized by a Phantom Barber. He would break into homes late at night, but he wasn't there to rob the home. Instead, he was there to give women and girls an unwanted nocturnal haircut, leaving with nothing but a handful of hair. In mid-June of that year, he cut off the hair of 3 little girls in a span of just 1 week. The very first 2 girls who fell victim to this Phantom Barber was 11-year-old Mary Evelyn Briggs and 12-year-old Edna Marie Heidel. The 2 girls had been fast asleep in their bedroom at the convent of Our Lady of Victories when somebody crept into the room and snipped off their hair. Bloodhounds were called to the convent the next day, and they were able to follow the trail of the man to the edge of the woodland, where it appeared that he got a quick getaway on a bicycle. Then the next victim was 6-year-old Carol Peaty, and she had been awoken after sleeping next to her twin brother to find that somebody had cut off her blonde curls. Her parents found this sandy footprint on one of the empty beds in her bedroom, which they obviously presumed was from this Phantom Barber. Now, all 3 of these girls reported that the Phantom Barber didn't physically harm them in any way, and one of the girls had awoken to see the man launching himself through her bedroom window, and she described him to police as short and fat. So let's talk about the pursuit of this Phantom Barber, because he was very difficult to catch. First of all, the police couldn't even figure out what the motive of somebody like this would have. Like, what would make someone want to commit such a bizarre crime? And in an attempt to try and capture this Phantom Barber, police put forward a $300 reward, hoping that someone would speak up or would see him or would catch him. And at the time of this strange crime, the army had dim out regulations in the town, which had allowed the Phantom Barber to move through the area without fear of being sighted, because everyone had to turn their lights off at a certain time. So for a very short period of time, they decided to relax on these regulations so that all hours of the night the town would be lit up, which they hoped would make it easier to catch this guy. As more time went by, the reward soon went up to $500, which was a lot of money for 1942. And the police speculated that this Phantom Barber must have been a long-time resident of the town because he seemed very well acquainted to the layout, especially in the dark. He was able to prowl through the night without being seen, and you have to be a pro of the town to do that. So then more victims began to arise. Before the month of June came to a close, the Phantom Barber took another victim's hair, but this time the victim wasn't a child, it was a woman for the first time. Her name was Mrs. R.E. Taylor, and she had been sleeping beside her husband and her two daughters when she had this vague recollection of something passing over her face. She said that she woke up and felt ill and saw that a bunch of her hair had been snipped off. She believed that the Phantom Barber had actually used chloroform to keep her asleep while he took off about 2 inches of her hair. And the next day, to everyone's surprise, it was announced that a man had actually been arrested for these crimes. And so everyone in the town felt relief. They thought that he had actually been captured. While the Phantom Barber had not harmed anybody, the notion that somebody could slip into your home undetected and chop off your hair was a terrifying one to the entire community. So when he was caught, everyone was like, phew, my hair's gonna be okay. But then they started to think that they got the wrong man. The relief didn't last long because only a few days after they arrested the man they thought did this, a married couple named Mr. and Mrs. Terrell Heidenberg had been attacked on the night of June 13th. And they were actually both beaten with an iron pipe while they slept. And actually the husband was beaten with such force that he lost a few of his teeth. So the police thought that this must have been the Phantom Barber, even though historically he had not harmed anyone, he only took hair, and in this case he did not leave with either of this couple's hair. Then more break-ins in the area were reported. Late at night, somebody had been cutting screens and creeping into people's homes through their windows, much like the Phantom Barber. However, instead of cutting people's hair, this person would take their clothing and would throw it all over the floor, like they would mess up their house. They would also take dishes and chinaware and throw it on the floor. Everything would break and crash. So they released the man they had originally caught, thinking that the Phantom Barber must still be out there and maybe he's starting to do different kind of crimes. And then they arrested a man named William A. Dolan. He was 57 years old. They captured him in late July. He was apparently a German-educated chemist, and what's so creepy is that police found a large quantity of human hair behind his house. However, after Dolan's arrest, he constantly told people that he was innocent. And while this conviction answered some questions, one massive question still remained that everyone in the town was asking: did they actually capture the Phantom Barber, or was there a couple different people breaking into the houses that they thought was just one person, but it actually wasn't, and maybe the Phantom Barber was still out there? So this mystery is still categorized as unsolved because William A. Dolan said he was innocent of cutting people's hair. So the Phantom Barber could have still been out there, could have still been roaming free for a very, very long time. This whole thing is so confusing and so creepy because I cannot imagine waking up in the morning with part of my hair missing. No thank you. Alright guys, so let's get right into today's video. Derek and Maria Broaddus couldn't have been more excited to move into their dream house at 657 Boulevard in the town of Westfield, New Jersey. But as the couple was preparing to settle into the $1.3 million house with their 3 children, they received this disturbing note in the mail. Now at the very bottom, this note was only signed The Watcher. It had no return address, and whoever wrote this letter to this family family seemed to be watching them very closely. The first letter arrived on a June evening. Jarek Broaddus had been painting a few walls at his family's new home, and after finishing up, he checked the mail to discover a white card-sized envelope, and it was addressed in this thick handwriting to the new owner. Now, the letter started off with these warm words of welcome, so it seemed pretty normal at first, but it soon developed into these bizarre and threatening messages, and this person said that they had been watching their house for decades, even before they moved in. They even claimed that their father and grandfather before them were also watchers of this specific house for some reason. So literally through this watcher's generation of family, they've just been watching this house. Here are some of the things that were in the letter. He said, "Do you know the history of this house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out." Like, could you imagine just moving into a house and receiving letters in your mailbox by that? Excuse me, no. Some other things that were in the letter said, "I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. Tisk, 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 bad mood. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy." So like, whoever's watching this house is upset that they're making renovations and changing it to be their own. This person always wants the house to be the way that it was, even though it's not their house, so why do they care? Even more disturbing, the watcher noted the Broaddus' 3 children and asked if there were more on the way. He was saying things like, "Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me." Ew. Unsettled, Derek Broaddus called the Westfield police, who recommended moving any construction equipment they had outside the house away in case the watcher became bold enough to throw it through one of the home's windows. The police also told them not to say anything about this case to their neighbors yet, because now all of their neighbors essentially were suspects. So then this family decided to contact the previous family who had lived in this house to see if they had been experiencing the same thing that they were. The previous family said that they had received one note right before they moved. It was signed by the watcher, but they said that over the 23 years they lived there, they didn't receive anything except for before they moved. So they're claiming this watcher person is lying, but they could have also been lying just so they weren't liable for selling this house when there was clearly a stalker involved. Derek and Maria Broaddus just couldn't shake their fear that they were being watched 24/7. And the letters began addressing this family by name. He was even addressing their children's names, which is so messed up. The watcher mentioned an easel that one of their daughters had set up on a porch, only visible from the side or rear of the house, and he asked in his note, "Is she the artist in the family?" He also asked things like, "Have you discovered what's in the walls yet?" Imagine if he had like cameras or like something watching from the inside as well. So Derek and Maria began to feel very paranoid. Obviously, they began to be really nervous being outside, going on walks, seeing their neighbors, because they had no idea if just a normal neighbor they were talking to was the one sending the letters. There's like no one you can trust at this point. So because they were so worried, they decided to put their renovations on the house on hold, and they went and lived somewhere else for a while with family that could protect them, and so the watcher wouldn't know where they went. So a third letter arrived a couple weeks later that said, "Where have you gone to? 657 Boulevard is missing you." So they once again sent these letters to the police, and for a time, an investigator thought that a next-door neighbor named Michael Langford, who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, was involved. However, they checked the DNA on the envelopes and it did not trace back to this man who they thought it was. It actually indicated that a woman sealed these envelopes with her saliva. So people began to believe that maybe the Broadduses may have created the watcher themselves, but the DNA samples showed that the family was not involved either. The police concluded that the letter writer didn't appear overtly threatening, but their obvious erratic thoughts could suggest unpredictability. And despite doing this huge investigation, they never found out who it was. Like, literally nothing came of this. Finally, 6 months after the first letter arrived, Derek and Maria put the house on the market, asking for a bit more than they had paid, as they assumed their renovations would raise the value. However, because they disclosed these bizarre letters to the public, no one wanted to buy the house, understandably. In 2016, they wanted to tear down the house and rebuild it and create it into something new to hopefully sell it. But unfortunately, their plans were not approved, and they got a final letter from the Watcher threatening to give them revenge if they did any changes to the house. He says maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick day and day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet, loved ones suddenly die, planes and cars and bicycles crash, bones break. And I went on to say, you wonder who the Watcher is? Turn around, idiots. What? After years on the market, the Watcher house finally sold in 2019, with the Broadduses taking a $440,000 loss. And this story was so shocking that Netflix bought the rights to make, I think it was either a documentary or a movie on this. I don't know if it's on the app right now, but honestly, guys, this is one of the creepiest stories I've ever read, and it's completely true. It's not like a creepypasta, like this actually happened. It just shows you how bizarre the world can be and how scary the world can be. So I hope this never happens to anybody else, because that's horrible. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk about these real-life vampires. So this is the story of the Carter brothers. According to lore, one day in 1932, a young girl frantically ran down a New Orleans street screaming. No one knew it yet, but she had just escaped from a house shared by two brothers named John and Wayne Carter. And as she made her way down Royal Street, a New Orleans police officer stopped her and listened to her incredible story. Supposedly, she and others were tied up in the Carter's home so the pair could drink their blood. Now, the girl had cuts all over her arms to prove it, and they rushed her to the hospital right away because she literally looked gray from all the blood that she had lost. By the way, possible trigger warning, there's a lot of blood talk in this video, okay? It's vampires, blood just goes with that, so just so you know. Well then, the police made their way to the Carter home to investigate the girl's claims of vampires in the French Quarter. They knocked on the door, but of course, no one came to let them in, so they had to break in, and they were shocked by what they found. There were dozens of bodies all over the house, all of them drained of blood. Some of them were even wrapped in sheets and looked like they had been there for days. Now, they knew the Carter brothers were dock workers currently at work and had no idea about their prey escaping and alerting the authorities. So police decided to wait in the brothers' apartment for them to get home from work so that they could apprehend them. So these brothers had no idea they were working away and had no clue they were about to be arrested. Some sources say that police left 10 of their largest officers in the Carter apartment to take on the alleged vampires when they returned after dark to feed. Apparently, the brothers worked from pre-dawn to dusk, removing the bandages from their captives' wrists and drinking their blood before wrapping them up again. So when the brothers got back from work on this night, it supposedly took 8 police officers to restrain them. And these two men were just average size. They weren't huge, they weren't super muscular, they were just two dudes. And 8 police officers had to jump on them. There are some sources say that they were only 5'6" and 160 pounds, so they were not big guys. They were able to fight off the police officers and then leapt from their balcony, and then unharmed, the two bolted off into the night. Now, this is where it shows that the Carter brothers weren't that intelligent, because after they escaped, they just went to work the next day like nothing happened, and obviously the police were there waiting for them. And as soon as they were in cuffs, John and Wayne supposedly began admitting that they were vampires. And they also asked police to go ahead and them, because if they didn't, they would continue capturing people and drinking their blood while they remained alive. So they basically looked at police and were like, listen, if you don't we're gonna keep doing what we're doing. I mean, at least they were honest about it, but wow. They were presumably unable to convince the courts of their superhuman status, so they were held accountable for their actions, found guilty, and sentenced to death for their crimes. And after their executions, the men were laid to rest in their family vault in New Orleans. Now, this is where the mystery definitely continues. When the next Carter family member passed away, the vault holding John and Wayne was opened to slide in the new casket. However, the vault allegedly held no trace of the brothers' remains at all. And this added even more fuel to the fire and the theory that they actually were undead and they had escaped from their tombs. Because how do you bury people and suddenly they're completely gone? And these tombs are sealed shut. They're made out of stone and they were gone. And ever since their escape from their family vault, people have reported to have seen the brothers out and about in New Orleans. Someone living in their apartment located in the house on the corner of St. Anne and Royal Street claimed he saw two men on the balcony. And just as they did the day the police ambushed them, the pair of specters leapt from the balcony and into the ether. This is like the most common claim. People will see the two brothers leaping off balconies, which is super creepy. And especially because they look sort of ghostly when they do it. Other stories talk about people seeing them specifically during the celebration of Mardi Gras, with their favorite pastime being whispering in people's ears and once again jumping off balconies. Now what's creepy is that one of their victims supposedly also turned into a vampire, and this is also documented, so what? So the legend has it that in order for one to turn into a vampire, they must be fed upon 7 times and live. And according to many reports, several of the living victims found in the Carter apartment fit these circumstances. Supposedly there was this one victim of theirs named Felipe who went on his own rampage of blood drinking, tallying at least 32 victims. So after the Carter brothers were feeding on him, he suddenly turned into a vampire and then fed on other people. And his diary was found in a Bourbon Street dwelling and documented his descent into madness, reporting crazed dreams of blood. And then he disappeared from the city in 1949. Now, apparently there are pages of this diary online. So if you want me to do a whole video literally reading the diary of a vampire, I can do that. Give this video a thumbs up and let me know. Another source alleges that a different vampire emerged from the Carter apartment, eventually racking up a victim toll of 442 people. So the Carter brothers are creating even worse vampires. One victim escaped vampirism, but reportedly committed herself voluntarily to an insane asylum after her ordeal. So they caused a lot of problems. And this is crazy to me that this is from our history. Now, listen, it could be embellished, it could be over-exaggerated, which is probably the case, but there are accounts of people just enjoying drinking blood, vampire or not, which is super creepy. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into today's video talking about the Bunnyman legend. There is a terrifying urban legend from Virginia that has been haunting locals for decades. It's known as the tale of the Bunnyman or the story of the Bunnyman Bridge. The bridge is more of a single lane tunnel with a railroad overpass running on top of it. And there are so many different versions of this infamous tale because it seems to change depending on who tells it. The story takes on the characteristics of a game of telephone, with new details added every time it's told. There was actually a student from the University of Maryland who was researching this legend, and they said there are over 50 different variations of this Bunnyman legend, which is insane. So let's start with the true story that inspired this very creepy legend. Back in 1970, a man was driving down a road in Fairfax County when someone in a white rabbit suit leapt out of the bushes in front of his car and shouted that he was trespassing. The bunny then hurled a hatchet through the car window before running off into the bushes again. And this was actually reported in the newspapers in the 70s. So this was real. This actually happened. It was all over the news. People were freaked out by it. Then a week later, this mysterious bunny man was seen again with an axe, chopping away at the roof support beams of a new structure that was being built by the road. And by the time the police was called and they got there, he was already gone. So this Bunnyman seems very protective over this road, doesn't want any new buildings on it, doesn't want people there. And then a third attack happened when the Bunnyman, once again armed with an axe, chopped away at the roof of a car, terrifying those inside. And thankfully, all of these people that were in these scenarios were unharmed. They got away. But obviously, it still really terrified the town to see all of these things in the newspaper. These 3 instances from the 70s are allegedly real real, and that is why people started to create legends behind who this Bunnyman could be, since he was never caught. So let's talk about the creepier legends that stemmed from these newspaper articles. One version of the urban legend shares that a mental patient escaped from a local asylum and found refuge in the woods around the bridge in Clifton, Virginia. He had apparently been put away after he took the lives of his wife and daughter, and he remained in hiding by that bridge and lived on wild rabbits to stay alive, leaving their half-eaten remains by the bridge. And then one year on Halloween, some children were hanging out near the bridge around midnight, and they were confronted by the man, and he attacked them and hung their bodies over the bridge by the dead rabbits, which is awful. This story is definitely very gruesome. Another version says a bus carrying convicts from a nearby insane asylum crashed, and one of the prisoners escaped into the woods of Clifton, Virginia. And during a search of the area, police found carcasses of dead rabbits hanging from the trees around the train overpass, and then they were eventually able to locate the suspect. They found the man wearing rabbit pelts, and the man tried to run away from police, and as they were chasing him, he was hit by an oncoming train on the bridge. His spirit is said to haunt that location to this day, and some have said his ghost may even appear at midnight on Halloween. It is said that at the stroke of midnight on Halloween, a killer in a white rabbit suit awaits. Lore has it, if you speak his name 3 times, he'll appear. Bunnyman, Bunnyman, Bunnyman. But the legend says, don't expect to survive. It says he will attack you and will leave your body dangling from the bridge. True story or not, the town of Clifton, Virginia has embraced the tale of the Bunnyman, and visitors are even able to purchase like t-shirts with the Bunnyman on it, different souvenirs that has his image on it. Some people have also said that the story of Bunnyman Bridge may have provided inspiration for the Bunnyman character Frank in the 2001 movie Donnie Darko. The movie was directed by Richard Kelly, who grew up in Virginia, so it's possible he may have heard the story. But yeah, this is really terrifying. If I was ever in the area, I would definitely go see it. But yeah, without further ado, let's jump right into today's video. June and Jennifer Gibbons were born on April 11th, 1963 in Barbados, and moved to a small town in Wales soon after. Now, my mom was actually born in Barbados not too long after them, actually. Not that that pertains to this story at all, but I found that interesting. Now, what makes this story so intriguing about these twins is that they both refused to speak to anyone. They would literally only speak to each other and sometimes their little sister Rose. They had this made-up twin language that they would use and no one would understand them. But one day a psychologist actually secretly recorded them talking to each other. And what she discovered is that they were actually speaking English to one another, but at an incredibly fast speed. So literally this psychologist had to slow down the tape to understand what they were saying. How eerie is that? Now at school, the girls were frequently bullied to the point where school administrators let them leave early to avoid torment. So people at the school just thought they were so weird, so strange, and they treated them horribly. And it got so bad that teachers literally did not think they should be at school, so they left. And the bullying actually made the girls withdraw even more than they were before. And in an attempt to socialize them, June and Jennifer were sent to separate boarding schools. And this was the first time in their life they had ever been separated. And they literally became catatonic away from each other until they were reunited again. Now I find it so strange that they would decide to separate twins to make it easier on them. Who separates twins? And if you guys don't know what catatonic means, if you're in that state, you're basically unable to move or speak or really do anything. So basically they could not function without each other, which is kind of sad, to be honest. The girls soon turned to writing, both fiction and keeping extensive diaries. When they got older, they even started writing novels, and they would self-publish them, but they never really got any exposure or attention in the literary world because of how violent these novels were. They would write about some pretty horrific things. And also what they were writing about was almost just too bizarre for people to understand, so they never got popular as authors. Instead, they turned to petty crime for excitement and attention, and they were caught burning a building to the ground. So in 1982, the judge sentenced them on 16 accounts counts of burglary and arson, and they were both declared criminally insane. So they were taken to Broadmoor Hospital, which is a very high security hospital for criminals. And obviously they still refused to speak. They had antisocial behavior. They had zombie-like movements. It literally says that, zombie-like movements. Everything about them was just strange, which is why they were taken to basically this mental hospital. While at Broadmoor, the girls were kept in separate wards, but spent all of their social time together. And what's kind of creepy is that nurses would find them in the same pose and position in each of their rooms, even though they were separated. It was like if one was sitting cross-legged, the other one would be sitting cross-legged. If one was on the bed with her arms behind her head, the other one would be too. It was like even though they couldn't see each other, they would be mimicking each other's movements, and that really freaked out the nurses. And then on several occasions, the girls would attack each other for no reason at all, and they often took turns eating. One day one would eat, while the other would abstain. So they just had this strange, unhealthy, codependent relationship. They couldn't exist apart, but they couldn't lead a normal life together. The one twin named Jennifer was only 10 minutes younger than her sister June, but Jennifer thought that June was so much prettier than her. She also thought that June was so much smarter than her, so Jennifer had this massive amount of jealousy for her sister. And June would sense this jealousy all the time, and she even wrote one day in her diary, it says, "She wants us to be equal. Dear Lord, I am scared of her. She is not normal. Someone is driving her insane. It is me. She is the dark sister robbing me of sunlight." So that's a pretty dark and eerie diary entry right there. One day, this journalist, her name was Marjorie Wallace, she heard about these twins because a lot of people were talking about them. So one day she sat down and had tea with the twins one day. And it was so strange because as they were sitting there, Jennifer randomly brought up that she had to die. And when the journalist asked her why, she responded with, this is a quote, "Because we decided." It says, "It would not be enough to live separately. They would always possess one another. One of them had to die so the other could live a normal life." It is such a strange concept, and these twins really believed that. In 1993, the girls were finally granted a transfer to a place called Caswell Clinic. But when the twins arrived at this new place, people noticed that Jennifer looked very, very ill. She was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead of acute myocarditis, which is basically this sudden lethal inflammation of the heart. And it's normally either caused by a viral infection, drugs, or being poisoned. And what's strange is that doctors found no evidence of any of that in her body when she died. So the cause of this thing happening to her has never really been identified. So after Jennifer passed away, June was really grief-stricken by the loss, but she was also relieved. This is what she said after her sister passed away. She said, "We were war-weary. It had been a long battle. Someone had to break the vicious circle." So today, June lives a very normal life. She speaks to people again, she lives independently, and she completely put the past behind her. She visits her sister's grave often. It is inscribed with a poem written by June. So this is what she wrote on her sister's grave. "We once were two, we two made one. We no more two, though life be one. Rest in peace." So that is literally what is on her gravestone. So I just found this story to be so intriguing. It's very sad, it's very eerie, and it's all very, very real and baffles people all around the world, baffles psychologists, doctors. It's just crazy to me. Obviously, there's so much more detail you can look up. It's all over the internet. So if you guys want to comment anything down below that I missed, definitely feel free to. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk about the Muffin Man. It's still so weird to say. Okay, so the Muffin Man, like I said, it's a traditional nursery rhyme that was actually written in 1820. And the rhyme goes, "Do you know the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man? Do you know the Muffin Man who lived on Drury Lane?" I feel like many of you listening probably think of Shrek whenever you hear this rhyme, the gingerbread man. Do you know the Muffin Man? Poor Victorians spent long hours at work, usually working working 12 hours a day with only Sundays off, so that didn't leave a lot of time for cooking. Few had kitchens and instead had to cook their food on an open fireplace, which was hot and smoky work. So many people chose to buy their food from the wide variety of street sellers instead. So Victorian people had a lot of their fresh food delivered right to their doorstep. Food such as muffins, which were delivered door to door by a vendor known as the Muffin Man, and there were hundreds of them. Muffin men could be found all over town in the 19th century, knocking on doors to see if anyone wanted to buy their baked goods, and they usually annoyed people with their loud bells because they would literally be carrying baskets of muffins and ringing this loud bell all throughout the streets. And this tradition continued until about the 1930s. And the muffin in question was actually a bread item known as an English muffin, not like the typical sweet muffin that you might be thinking of. Healthy meals were expensive, so many families relied on bulky foods like bread and muffins to fill them up. And other street sellers sold things like fish, hot eels, pea soup, baked potatoes, meat pies, stuff like that. Now, what I found to be so creepy while doing research for this video is that the Muffin Man was also a nickname for this 16th century child murderer. The rhyme was supposedly written to warn kids away from Drury Lane, where a notorious Muffin Man would lure them to their deaths with sweet food. Now, there are many different versions of this very horrifying story. The Muffin Man was also known as the Drury Lane Slicer, who was actually the first known serial killer in England. His real name was apparently Frederick Thomas Linwood. He was born in 1563 and he died in 1612. And there are many accounts of his crimes, but there's no records of them. So this is either a really creepy folklore story or one of history's most creepy mysteries. And there's just no surviving records, but there were at one point. The Muffin Man would make his deliveries just like other bakers, but he would lure children away from their homes by playfully tying a string to a muffin and pulling it away from the steps where the parcels lay. The kids, thinking this was some sort of fun game, would chase the muffin being pulled on a string, which would lead them to this Muffin Man's bakery, where he would grab them, pull them inside, and obviously you know what comes next. These kids would not step out of there alive. And apparently this Muffin Man also did not like having competition around him in the town, so it's said that he would go and murder the other bakers, so he would be the only one making muffins. And according to lore, he used wooden spoons to knock children out. However, experts have long cast doubt that a wooden spoon would be enough to render a person unconscious, but still these wooden spoon stories exist. It is said that between the years of 1589 and 1598, he ended up murdering 15 children, which is awful. So the children came up with this catchy, sing-songy rhyme that was apparently this way to warn other children to stay away from Drury Lane, which is so creepy. It also warns children to stay away from his bakery and to be wary of people around them. So if they ever did have to pass this particular bakery, they would have their eye out, making sure they were not talking to strangers and not following any muffins on a string. Now, like I said, no one knows if this story is true. People are leaning it to be more towards folklore, and this story has been told and retold so many times that it seems the true origins are lost. I also found this creepy legend that says that if you stand on your front porch while holding a muffin after dark and you sing the song, you'll be able to see his spirit walking towards your house holding a basket of muffins. But it says, be warned, you must run and close your door before he reaches your porch. So that is also really terrifying. And whenever I see stuff like that, I am tempted to do it on the vlog channel because I am crazy and because it does lean more to folklore. So I'm kind of like, oh, I love folklore. But obviously, if this was true, that is awful, and I am hoping and praying that it's not. Anyway. But without further ado, let's get right into today's video. Today we're talking about a very bizarre crime from history. It's also very creepy, not just bizarre. And it's about a man who lived with spiders, an attic man, if you will. There was a man named Philip Peters that had been living in his home in Denver, Colorado for over 3 decades, and here is an actual photograph of his house. He was married to a woman named Helen, who had just recently broken her hip in a fall. For 5 weeks, she was in the hospital recovering, so Philip was just at home alone. And his neighbors would open their homes to him in the evenings so he wouldn't have to be by himself at dinner time, which I honestly think is like the sweetest thing for them to do. I love when you have like a true community in your neighborhood. Well, on the night of October 17th of 1941, Philip walked into his house to see a tall, gaunt, and disheveled man raiding his fridge. So this fight broke out between them, and the strange man grabbed Philip's cast iron stove shaker and beat him to death with it before fleeing. So Philip was discovered hours later by his very worried neighbors. Maybe he hadn't come to dinner on time, and the Denver police were obviously called once they saw the state that he was in. And the police searched all around the house but couldn't find any evidence of the murderer. It was like he just vanished into thin air. And then Philip's wife came home from the hospital healed, but she was now a widow. So a good friend of hers moved in with her to just help around the house. And this is where some very strange occurrences start happening. In the months following Helen's return, she and her friend reported weird things happening around the house. Food was going missing, strange sounds were heard throughout the day and night. Things were just out of place. Like she would put something down, maybe a book on a table, she would walk out of the room, come back, and the book would be placed somewhere else in the room or in the house. So Helen's friend was convinced that this house was haunted, maybe even by Philip himself, but she was just so sure there was a ghost messing with them. But obviously that would be kind of a ridiculous thing to just assume. So Helen decided to relocate to live with her son. She just wanted to be away from all the madness that was happening. So the house just stood vacant, and the strange sounds and disgusting smells continued to be reported to the police by the neighbors, but whenever they went there, they couldn't find anyone in the house. Everything changed in 1942 when 2 police officers decided to stay outside the house watching it for any strange activity. They waited for hours and hours and didn't see anything until one of them noticed this figure of a man walking back and forth inside the house through the windows. Can you imagine just how creepy this would be? Like, people are reporting that maybe there's a ghost in the house and finally they see something, a silhouette moving around. So they ran inside, but they couldn't find the figure anywhere. So they waited and waited some more until they heard a sound coming from upstairs. It kind of sounded like someone was walking around. So they ran up there following those sounds to a closet, and they sprung open the door just in time to spot a pair of legs disappearing through a tiny hole in the ceiling. It looked to be probably the entrance to the house's attic. So they grabbed the legs at the last second and they pulled the man down to the ground. They had finally caught the murderer. The man's name was Theodore Conies, and as a child he had poor health, which continued to plague him in adulthood, and because of that he wasn't able to work, and he ended up breaking into Philip and Helen's house to steal some food. But on his second attempt at doing this is when Philip just walked into his house and saw him raiding the fridge, and that's when he decided to attack Philip, ending his life. So it was kind of like a spur of the moment thing. He then went to hide in the attic where he stayed for months and months, creeping into the main part of the house whenever he was hungry, and the police sent their smallest officer to crawl up into that small hole into the attic, where they found that the man had made himself a nest of some sort. It smelled so bad that the officer actually vomited, and the attic was covered in giant spider webs with massive spiders crawling all over the place, and he was just living amongst those spiders. This is literally a quote from one of the officers. He said, "A man would have had to be a spider to stand it up there," because he was literally amongst thousands of spiders and he didn't even really care. So the newspaper heard about this and ran with it, and so he was literally dubbed the Denver Spider-Man. And no, not the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man in the red and blue suit. This guy was obviously a murderer and was just living in the attic. And it's crazy how many like true crime stories I've heard about people living in the attic. And I know I've done a couple videos in my real life from my sister and I hearing things in the attic and going up to explore to make sure no one's there. No one ever was, but we definitely have heard some strange noises up there. So stories like this really creep me out. And if you guys are interested in hearing like more like really bizarre true crime stories, give this video a thumbs up and let me know. I do like doing them, you know, from the early 1900s and stuff like that, because they're so far behind us that people forget and don't really hear about those stories that often. So I'm just really intrigued by them.
In an enchanted realm, an oddity stirs, beckoning the curious. Meet Jessii, once ensnared, now awakened, waiting to be yours.